A nice wood beam in a house can be the little detail that makes the room pop. However, a nice wood beam doesn't have to be made from a solid piece of lumber, which is heavy, expensive, and sometimes hard to find. Instead, sometimes it's better to avoid using real wood. This is the most lightweight, simple, and most realistic false beam that you can use to cover dimensional lumber. The reason why this beam is so lightweight is because it's hollow, which is made to cover this hideous beam I have at the shop. And it's made from 1/4 inch thick veneer sheet material. Keep the weight down, and yet counterintuitively, it's very sturdy, as you'll see. There's several ways of building beams like this, such as using a miter fold technique, but unlike the miter fold technique, which can be a little tricky to set up and get it right, with any beam, you need to figure out how long, how tall, and how wide it needs to be. In my case, I had some little extra obstacles to cover, so to get my size right, I just ended up drawing it on the wall. It never hurts to leave a little extra wiggle room making these things. For some reason, things always end up being a little tighter than you expect after it's built. What I find great with this type of beam is there's lots of flexibility. You can make it as big or as small as you'd like it to be. Unlike if this was a solid piece of lumber, you're kind of stuck with the size of material of what you got. Although I did have to slightly adjust the width to suit the widest piece of Knotty Alder I had lying around, which wasn't a big deal. I needed a little bark on it for character anyway. After cutting it to my width, I pulled out the old wood stretcher and added some extra length to my piece of wood to get it long enough. The wood stretcher in this case, if you're wondering, was some biscuits, some glue, and a bar clamp. If you end up having to stretch your wood like I do, save milling down your thickness after it's all glued up. Just like this. I ended up grabbing an extra hand for some extra support. I pre-cut the length of my piece so that I could test fit it and see how I would have to maneuver the beam into the room once it was built, which was a good idea in theory. However, I would find out later I made a slight oversight when doing this. With the bottom milled up, the next parts I needed are my sides, and to keep things super lightweight, I ended up just using some 1/4 inch veneered sheet material that got cut up on the CNC. However, this can be done on the table saw all the same. I only had one sheet to make the sides with, which was enough material. First, I laid out the pieces to figure out the best match in the grain for gluing things together. If I had more material, I could have definitely done a better job of the seam and matching things up. I again had to get a little creative and stretch these out to get the length I needed. But because this material is only a 1/4 inch thick, I had to do something a little different to splice these together. To glue the seams together, I cut a small chunk of the 1/4 inch material to lap over the joints and glued this to the backside of one with some CA glue and activator. When this was set, I just used some wood glue along the edge and again some more CA glue and activator and carefully lined up the two pieces, instantly gluing them together without the use of clamps. Yep. Pretty sweet. Of course, the benefit of doing it this way is that you instantly have a full round piece that is glued together without having to use long clamps and waiting for the glue to dry. The wood glue at the seam helps to hold the seam together once dried and helps fill any voids if done right. With both sides done, I just had to cut them to length and set them aside before moving on to the next step. Here's where we strengthen that bottom board and make adding the sides on a breeze. So I'll just cut some strips that will go down both sides of the beam. Now I have a handy little trick to take some small scrap pieces of the same side material, such as my 1/4 inch veneered material, and use this as a spacer. Just run some glue in the back of your strip, flip it over, nail the strips down from the inside, and just be sure to use that little spacer to position your strips so that the side material will be perfectly flush with the side of the beam.
Perfectly flush.
Or slightly inside, but just make sure not sticking past, and this is important as you'll see. Now it's on to fastening the sides. However, it would be wise to suck up your pride and ask for a second hand, as I did, because trust me, things go so much easier here. Just go along again and run some glue on the edge of the nailed strip and along the bottom where the board and the edge of the side will meet. And if you do things right and listen to me on using the little spacer properly, things will be a breeze. Just place the side into position, line up the ends, and use a quick clamp to squeeze down the side tight as you go along and nail the sides into place on both sides. I ended up making some temporary supports that I tacked into 3 places along the beam to give some extra support to help line things up and hold things in place until I was ready to install the beam. To give this beam a little more visual appeal and make it look a little more rustic and realistic, I just ran the bevel bit along it backwards, intentionally unevenly. Keep the edge more natural looking. With that out of the way, it's on to everyone's favorite step, sanding and filling things as needed. Just be careful when sanding the sides and seams not to sand through the veneer, because that would suck. With the enjoyable sanding finished, it's on to the last and probably my favorite step before installing it, and that's to put a finish on it. I ended up just clear coating the Knotty Alder with 2 coats of clear lacquer, sanding in between. Feel free to stain yours if you want. However, I prefer to do this all beforehand on the ground at an easy working height, avoiding ladders and having to work above head and masking everything off.
Looks groovy. Can't wait.
Fortunately, in my excitement, I remembered to remove the temporary braces before trying to install this beam, along with the foresight to remove some of the trim that was in my way. Should be able to just slip my beam straight up because I won't have room to tip it this way, or I won't have room to twist it that way. Go straight up, push it over, and then up. It should fit. I'm definitely glad I made this light. As I said earlier, there was a slight mishap. As we started pushing up the beam in place, it got a little tight, too tight, which meant it needed some trimming, which is better than being too loose.
Come down. Okay. Yeah, it's a bit of a bulge there.
So down it came, and after a quick trim, back up it went.
Nice.
To help hold this beam in place beforehand, I had put some construction adhesive along the inside of the top edge of the beam, and just tacked it with some brad nails at the top along the way, and voila! One much nicer beam, with very little effort, time, and cost. Maybe it's time I upgrade some of the old yellow oak trim in the shop to match. That's for another day. But for today, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss out on other useful videos I have, like how to keep miters from opening up when you're installing trim around window and doors.